There is a stretch of the Florida coast where a city stands that was never meant to be. A little over a century ago, this was a drowned wilderness of sawgrass and mangrove, ruled by mosquitoes and fever, so remote that fewer than 300 people were willing to call it home. There were no roads worth the name. There was no fresh water that came easily. In summer, the heat pressed down like a hand, and the swamp behind the shoreline ran westward for the length of a small country, impassable and indifferent to anyone who dared to cross it. By every measure that mattered, this was a place that refused human life. And yet today, nearly 6.5 million people live along that same shoreline. Glass towers rise where the mangroves once stood. The city's name is spoken in the same breath as the great financial capitals of the world. This is the story of Miami, Florida, a city dredged up out of the sea, drained out of a swamp, and built against all reason on ground that was never solid to begin with. It is one of the most impossible rises in the history of America, and it may yet prove one of the most fragile. To understand how unlikely Miami was, you have to see the land as it once was. For nearly 2,000 years, the people known as the Tequesta lived at the mouth of a short, dark river that emptied into Biscayne Bay. They fished the shallows and buried their dead in the limestone, and they left almost nothing behind but a ring of holes carved into the bedrock, a circle we would not rediscover until 1998. By the time European settlers took real notice of the bay, the Tequesta were gone, carried off by disease and war, and the land had returned to silence. What remained was not welcoming. Spanish sailors had claimed the coast as early as 1566, but no settlement ever held. The United States Army built a garrison called Fort Dallas near the river in 1836 during the long and bitter Second Seminole War, a conflict so destructive it nearly emptied the region of people entirely. For decades afterward, only a scattering of families lived along the Miami River. A trader named William Brickell and his wife Mary set up a trading post on the south bank around 1870. And for the rest of the century, they were among the only permanent residents for miles in any direction. The land itself seemed built to keep people out. To the west lay the Everglades, a river of grass 60 miles wide and hundreds of miles long, moving so slowly it looked like standing water. The coastline was fringed with mangrove swamp, tangled and flooded, known chiefly as the haunt of alligators, reptiles, and clouds of mosquitoes thick enough to darken a lantern. There was no railroad. There was barely a path. In the summer of 1895, a Florida state census counted just 9 people living at the mouth of the Miami River. 9. This was the seed from which a great American city would grow. The person who looked at that emptiness and saw a city was not a tycoon. She was a widow from Cleveland named Julia Tuttle. Tuttle had first seen Biscayne Bay as a young woman, and she never forgot it. After her husband died and her parents left her an inheritance, she bought 640 acres on the north bank of the river in 1891, including the old grounds of Fort Dallas, and she moved south into the wilderness with a conviction that bordered on prophecy. In a letter to a friend, she wrote that it was the dream of her life to see this wilderness turned into a prosperous country. She wanted a real city here, and she understood the one thing that could summon it out of the swamp: a railroad. The nearest railroad ended far up the coast. It belonged to Henry Flagler, a founder of Standard Oil and one of the wealthiest men in America, who had spent his later years laying track down the Florida coast and raising grand hotels beside it. Tuttle wrote to him. She traveled to see him in person. She offered to give away half of her land if only he would bring his trains to the river. And for years, Flagler said no, The bay was too far, the country was too wild, there was no reason to build a railroad to nowhere. Then came the winter that changed everything. In December of 1894, and again in February of 1895, a catastrophic freeze swept down through Florida and destroyed the citrus groves of the north, wiping out entire harvests and ruining the growers whose crops Flagler's railroad had been built to carry. But far to the south, on the banks of the Miami River, the cold never arrived. The gardens there stayed green and blooming in the middle of a statewide disaster. As the story goes, Julia Tuttle mailed Henry Flagler a sprig of fresh orange blossoms to prove that Miami had been spared the frost. It is one of the most beloved legends in all of Florida history, and it may not be true. Historians point out that Flagler more likely sent his own agents down to see the untouched bay for themselves, and that the Brickell family had already signed their own land agreement with him months before Tuttle signed hers. But the heart of the story is real. The freeze accomplished what years of letters could not. Flagler turned his attention south, and the impossible began to take shape. Tuttle and the Brickells each gave up great portions of their land, and Flagler agreed to bring the railroad, the water, and the streets. The first train reached the little settlement on the bay in April of 1896. Within months, the place was transformed. Flagler dredged the harbor, laid out the streets, funded the water and sewer lines, and began building a vast wooden resort called the Royal Palm Hotel, 5 stories tall, and painted the pale yellow of a Gilded Age dream. Workers poured in to clear the land and raise the buildings, and a great many of them were black laborers, many of Bahamian descent, whose hands did the hardest work of hauling the city into being. On July 28, 1896, those residents gathered to make the settlement official. Of the 344 men who cast votes to incorporate the new city, well over a third were black, and without them, there would not have been enough people present to lawfully form a city at all. They built Miami, and they voted it into existence. And then, in one of the very first acts of that new city, they were pushed into a segregated district set apart from the rest, a neighborhood that would come to be called Overtown. The grateful citizens wanted to name the city after Flagler. He declined, and so they named it instead for the river, and for the old word the vanished Tequesta had left behind. Miami. But the land had not surrendered. It had only paused. In the autumn of 1899, yellow fever swept through the young city. In a town of barely 1,700 people, more than 200 fell ill, and Miami was sealed under quarantine for the better part of 3 months, while the sick were isolated and their belongings burned. No one yet understood that the disease rode in on the bite of a mosquito. The very same mosquitoes that rose in clouds from the swamp the city had been built beside. Miami had willed itself into existence. Now it had to survive the place where it stood. The answer, as the new century began, was to remake the land itself. If the swamp would not yield, then the swamp would be drained. In 1906, under a governor named Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, who had won office promising to drain what he called an abominable, pestilence-ridden swamp, dredges began cutting canals into the Everglades. They carved great channels from Lake Okeechobee toward the sea, pulling the water off the land acre by acre and mile by mile, exposing black peat soil that had lain beneath the water for thousands of years. It was among the largest re-engineering of a natural landscape ever attempted on the continent. The developers who followed sold the reclaimed ground as farmland and home sites. And sometimes, when the water crept back in, they sold land that was still underwater to buyers who never came to look. And then, Miami caught fire. In the years after the First World War, a fever of another kind took hold of South Florida. It was a land boom, the largest the country had ever seen, and for a few delirious years in the early 1920s, it turned the swampy coast into the most frenzied real estate market in America. Northerners arrived by the trainload, lured by advertisements that promised eternal summer. Land that had once sold for a few dollars an acre was carved into lots and resold over and over, sometimes changing hands 10 times in a single day. Young salesmen called binder boys traded contracts on the street corners, pocketing a small deposit and flipping the paper before the ink had dried. By 1925, Miami was issuing building permits worth some $60 million, a staggering figure for a place that, a single generation earlier, had counted its residents in the hundreds. Two men embodied the mania. George Merrick took his family's grapefruit plantation and raised upon it Coral Gables, one of the first grand planned cities in America. A vision of Mediterranean arches and coral rock laid out street by careful street, much of it built by skilled Bahamian stonemasons. And across the water, an Indianapolis businessman named Carl Fisher looked at a mangrove sandbar too soft to hold a fence post and saw a resort. What Fisher did next is the truest symbol of the whole enterprise. He did not build on the land. He built the land. He sent dredges out into Biscayne Bay to suck the bottom up through enormous pipes and pump it onto the mangroves, burying the swamp beneath millions of tons of dead sea floor until dry ground appeared where there had been only water. He shipped in soil from the Everglades and planted palm trees in it. Out of the bay, he conjured entire islands that had never existed, and on those islands he built mansions and sold them to some of the richest men in the country. This was Miami Beach. It was, in the most literal sense imaginable, a city pulled up out of the sea. No boom built on air can last forever, and this one was already beginning to tremble. By the autumn of 1925, so much lumber and brick and steel was pouring into Miami that the railroads simply stopped. They declared an embargo, refusing all non-essential freight because the rail yards had become hopelessly clogged. Builders turned to the ocean instead, loading their materials onto ships bound for the harbor. And then, on the 10th of January 1926, a large sailing schooner called the Prince Valdemar capsized at the mouth of Miami's harbor and sank, turning sideways across the only channel into the port. For weeks, no ship could pass. The supplies stopped, the construction slowed, and the illusion of endless money began, quietly, to dissolve. Then the sky finished what the sea had started. On the 18th of September, 1926, a great hurricane came out of the Atlantic in the dark before dawn and struck the city almost without warning. Many residents were newcomers who had never seen a tropical storm, and when the eye passed over and the winds fell still, thousands walked out into the calm believing it was over, only to be caught in the open when the far side of the storm roared back with even greater fury. The water rose. Buildings that had gone up in a frenzy came down in an hour. When it was finally over, the American Red Cross counted at least 372 dead, and many believe the true number, swelled by migrant laborers whose names were never recorded, was far higher. The boom did not slow. It ended. Fortunes vanished overnight. The banks that had lent against imaginary land values began to fail, and Florida slid into an economic depression years before the rest of the country would even learn the word. The city that had risen faster than any other in America now stood half-built and broken beside the water, as though the land had finally answered back. And yet, Miami did not die. That may be the most impossible part of all. The city that emerged from the wreckage of the boom and then from the long gray years of the Great Depression was quieter, but it never stopped growing. Soldiers trained in its hotels during the Second World War and came back afterward to live in its sun. Air conditioning arrived and made the summers survivable at last. And in the decades that followed, wave upon wave of people came to the bay. none more transformative than the hundreds of thousands of Cubans who fled the island after the Revolution of 1959 and remade the city into something entirely new. A place that had begun as a frontier outpost became a bridge between two Americas, the doorway where the United States and Latin America meet. Today, the towers of Brickell, rising on the very land the Brickell family once farmed, hold banks from all over the world, and the district has earned the nickname the Wall Street of the South. The port below is among the busiest cruise harbors on Earth. The airport carries the majority of all the air trade between the United States and Latin America. The metropolitan region that grew up around that 9-person village on the river is now home to nearly 6.5 million people. From roughly 300 residents in 1896, Miami had multiplied beyond anything its founders could have pictured. Julia Tuttle got her city. She was never permitted to vote it into being because she was a woman, and she did not live to see what it would become. She died in 1898, only 2 years after Miami was born, still deep in the debt she had taken on to bring the railroad south at the age of 49. For a long time afterward, the world forgot her name. But the story does not end in triumph. It never really could. The city was built by defying water, by draining the swamp, by dredging the bay, by pumping dry land up out of the sea and daring the ocean to take it back. And now, a century on, the water is coming back to collect. Miami sits upon porous limestone, a foundation of ancient reefs so riddled with holes that the sea can rise up through the ground itself, indifferent to any wall built to hold it out. The land that Broward's dredges once drained has been sinking ever since, as the exposed peat dries and shrinks and gives itself back to the air. And the ocean around the city is rising faster than almost anywhere else in the world. On calm and cloudless days, seawater now bubbles up through the streets of Miami Beach, a thing so common it has been given a gentle name: sunny day flooding. In one study, researchers found that tidal flooding in the city had increased by more than 400% in the span of a single decade. By the measure that matters most, the total value of everything the water stands to destroy, Miami ranks as the single most exposed major city on the entire planet. The same ground that men once conquered, acre by acre and dredge by dredge, is being quietly reclaimed by the sea that was always waiting beneath it. There is something almost unbearable in the shape of it. A city summoned out of a swamp by nothing more than the force of human will, raised against every warning the land had to give, grown into a glittering capital of millions, and all of it standing on borrowed ground, above a rising sea, in the exact place the water had claimed as its own for 10,000 years before the first train ever came. Miami was the most impossible city that America ever built. It may also become the first great American city we watch the ocean take back. And when the historians of some distant century tell the story of this coast, they may find themselves marveling that, for one brief and brilliant moment, against all reason, there was a city here at all. If you find yourself drawn to the places that history built and time is slowly unmaking, stay with us. There are other cities and other stories still waiting to be told.